Veganism has to change. And in short, here's why. Can you remember the first time somebody told you that cigarettes were bad for your health? Or the first time someone told you there's hard scientific evidence that cigarettes cause cancer? Depending on how old you are, it's quite possible you can't. It's quite possible you heard that when you were a very young child, that it was part of your grade 4 education, that it's such an early memory. You can't remember the first time you learned that. Or you can't remember a time of your life when you thought cigarettes were good for your health. But for many people, depending on which generation they're from, depending on when they went through this process, many people grew up surrounded by propaganda and advertising that either just implicitly represented cigarette smoking as something luxurious, enjoyable, healthy, normal, and fun, or they actually even grew up with propaganda actively claiming that cigarettes were healthy. I can remember advertisements that made me laugh out loud from Lucky Strike, claiming that because they were toasted, because it's toasted, they were good for your health. Obviously, this is decades and decades ago. This type of advertising would be illegal today. The first time people learn that cigarettes cause cancer, that cigarettes are bad for their health, it may make a huge impact. It may or may not motivate them to quit smoking personally. It may lead them to regard their own life in a different way. I knew one fellow, he must be over 50 years old now. I don't know. I remember him saying passionately, and he grew up in Ireland. I don't know, I'm not to stereotype the Irish, but I remember him saying to me with real emotion that when he really found out what cigarettes had done to him, that he felt cheated, that he felt robbed, and that in large part he felt robbed of life itself, because when he found out, he was hospitalized. He was in a hospital bed, and he was coughing up unbelievable black tar from his lungs. I forget the medical details. Now he did get out of that hospital bed. He had 3 or 4 different health conditions, and 2 or 3 of them he managed to recover from, and he did quit smoking, and his life went on. But the impact of learning for the first time that cigarettes are terrible for you, it didn't have that impact the second time, the third time, the 5th time, the 10th time. It can't possibly. It becomes normal. It ceases to be new. It ceases to be shocking. It loses its ability to shock. It loses its ability to change human behavior. It goes from being a sudden clash of drums that gets your attention to being part of the regular drumbeat of our daily lives. I could say something similar about purely ethical concerns. Can you remember the first time you found out that the United States was using torture to extract information from enemy combatants or people they seem to pick out almost at random from their wars around the world? Can you remember your first time learning about that? For some of us, again, it might be grade 4. It might be childhood. For some of us, it might have been in our teenage years, in college, or even after we joined the workforce, when you really found out the details of routinized state-sanctioned torture. Can you remember when it was a sudden crash? And then can you remember the second time, the 5th time, the 10th time, how this just became part of the familiar drumbeat of daily life? Veganism has to change because the information that we've relied on getting people's attention and getting people's motivation up to this point is very much like that short-term shock. And when I look at groups like Direct Action Everywhere, I think what they're really trying to do is arrest the movement in that moment of horror, that moment of realization. They want people to not let go of that necessarily fleeting feeling that you've been lied to, that you've been cheated your whole life. You were told this was something wholesome. And not only is it bad for your health, it comes from an unbelievably unethical factory farming process, right? And for many people, maybe you watching this video, but maybe you also remember the first time you explained this to your own parents or to your boyfriends or girlfriends, to somebody in your life. You've probably been around somebody and you observed them the first time they really figured out where milk comes from. The first time they really figured out where meat comes from. But guess what? Just like learning that cigarette smoking is bad for you, the 5th time, the 10th time, the 100th time you've heard it, it loses its ability to shock. It loses its stunning effect of being a cymbal crash, whatever you want to say, and it becomes part of the drumbeat of daily life. Veganism, in some ways, has really had kind of a free ride, especially, I'd say, in the last 5 years, because of this medium right here, because of YouTube, because of video sharing on the internet. It's true. I mean, I can remember back when I was in high school, there were still photographs of factory farm conditions, and there was some momentum given to veganism. I don't know, 1997. I can remember what things were like back then. But it's true, there's nothing else quite like, I mean, the stereotypical experience is the first time somebody watched Earthlings, or the first time they watched From Farm to Fridge, any of these documentaries that collects together documentary film footage from inside factory farms, from inside slaughterhouses. Or maybe they just saw something on the internet that with no gore, with nothing, no explicit imagery, in a diagrammatic way explained to you where milk comes from, or why free-range chicken eggs really aren't so free at all, But all of that is now coming to an end. Lightning doesn't strike twice. The sense of shock and horror and short-term motivation that people took from this first encounter with the truth that was concealed by shiny packaging and, to some extent, yes, industry propaganda, and to some extent just the human capacity to hope that things will turn out for the best. Just wishful thinking, just straight up wishful thinking that you'd like to imagine milk is produced from some happy cartoon farm where the cows are frolicking in the fields, I mean, that's also part of what you're up against here is just human optimism, right? Veganism has to change. You may disagree with me about the way forward, but I hope just from this short video you can recognize the way forward is not the way back. We can't possibly do what Direct Action Everywhere is trying to do and try to hold ourselves by the throat and grab others by the throat with these emotive appeals, with breaking down weeping in a restaurant and screaming it's not food, it's violence, with pretending that moment of initial shock and horror is going to shake people out of their indifference, as perhaps you feel it shaked us out of ours. Okay? That's a fleeting moment, both in each person's life, on their progress towards veganism, and when you scale it up for society as a whole. There is, simply put, a point of diminishing returns to the shock caused by factory farm footage. And for that same reason, there is a point of diminishing returns to the whole political methodology of disruption and of confrontation. One of the most praised methods of activism right now is the so-called cube of truth. I don't know why they don't call it the square of truth, because it's two-dimensional, but of confronting strangers on the street with videotape footage of what's going on in factory farms. Maybe you can remember how you felt the first time you saw that kind of footage. But the second time, the 5th time, the 10th time, think about it. If we want long-term to be a society that smokes 0 cigarettes, we can't go around with this kind of emotive language trying to drag people back to that feeling of shock and horror when they first realized cigarettes cause lung cancer, showing them horrifying images of the esophagus and the lungs of people who've been impaired by this disease, who are dying a slow, painful death. It becomes part of the regular drumbeat of life. It becomes something everybody knows, and that not everybody, but the majority, accepts. If we aspire to become a society in which nobody smokes cigarettes, to become a society in which nobody eats meat, that's the road ahead. but it's not going to be based on short-term shock, awe, and anguish.